The country will be moving to alert level 2 with bans on travel between provinces and the sale of alcohol and tobacco products being lifted. The easing from level 3 is effective from Monday midnight, and the move follows a special cabinet meeting on Saturday afternoon. Throughout the week, cabinet received advice from health experts. Now, these experts have advised government that the country has now managed to arrest rapid transmission of the COVID-19 virus and that healthcare infrastructure would not be undermined.
Cabinet has decided to place the entire country on alert level 2 with effect from midnight on Monday, the 17th of August 2020. Alert level 2 in terms of our risk-adjusted strategy in dealing with the pandemic means that there is moderate COVID-19 spread of the virus with a relatively high health system readiness. The move to level 2 means that we can remove nearly all of the restrictions on the resumption of economic activity across most industries. Economic activity will be allowed with the necessary and appropriate stringent health protocols and safety precautions in place. Therefore, the following changes will take place with effect from under level 2. All restrictions on interprovincial travel will be lifted. Accommodation, hospitality venues and tours will be permitted according to approved protocols to ensure social distancing. Restaurants, bars and taverns will be permitted to operate according to approved protocols as to times of operation and numbers of people. Restrictions on the sale of tobacco will be lifted. The suspension of the sale of alcohol will be lifted subject to certain restrictions. Alcohol will be permitted for on-site consumption in licensed establishments only up to 10 p.m. Liquor outlets will be allowed to sell alcohol for off-site consumption from Monday to Thursday during the hours of 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. only.
For more analysis of the President's speech, we are also joined by Economist Alex Heever via Skype. Alex, a very good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome.
Good evening.
What are your thoughts with regards to the President's pronouncement that the country is moving from level 3 to level 2? Are you at all surprised?
I'm not surprised. I think there was quite a lot of talk about this, and government was under pressure to explain the remaining restrictions on economic activity, and it was struggling to do so. So those definitely needed to be done. So I think that this as a set of measures could have been done earlier, but I think it's certainly welcome that this has happened now finally.
Well, no doubt the South African economy has been severely battered by this COVID-19 pandemic. So do you get a sense that South Africa is well capacitated to recover from this pandemic?
I think it's going to take some time to get back to normal. I think just opening things up allows sort of the natural workings of the economy to get back into action again. Where we are going to struggle is public finances. The lost revenue from just from the tobacco and alcohol bans is probably round about close to 50% of the value of what we're going to borrow from the IMF. And this, to me, is a real concern. I think that our fiscal position is in serious distress, certainly when you look at it from a 3-year perspective, but it is also in a precarious position for the 2020-2021 financial year. And I think that a large part of that fiscal distress was unnecessary.
And the big figures that have been bandied about in terms of South Africa borrowing from the international financiers against a very limited and a severely battered fiscus as a result of people losing jobs, as a result of the loss of revenue through this ban on alcohol and tobacco products. Do you think we can, we could recover from this?
Well, I think that we can recover. I think we've made our position far more difficult than it needed to be. Because the spending that we have to do from government side to restore the performance of the economy is hugely constrained, because we're not really in a position to expand expenditure, given that the access to capital is now so restricted. So government's ability to borrow is in real difficulty at the moment, and that's really what you need. You want that flexibility and that space when you're trying to boost your economy out of a recession. But we really hit our economy in multiple ways, and it has had a feedback effect on government's finances. And as a consequence, government is actually not even in a position to deficit spend its way into additional growth. A strategy that you have to engage in very carefully when you do it, but now we don't even have that as a major option.
I mean, in its quest to economic recovery, what are some of the quick wins that the government should look for? What are some of the low-hanging fruit that the government should be picking in order to ensure a quick recovery?
But I think that all barriers to getting the economy functioning again need to be removed. But it's quite difficult to look at what additional measures are going to be undertaken. So, for instance, the idea of increasing infrastructure spending as a route to re-stimulating the economy is definitely something that should be considered. But it is quite difficult to do. Government has had real difficulties actually organizing itself to expand infrastructure spending. But now it faces the additional constraint that it would have to, it's not going to be able to borrow very easily in order to spend that money. From an international borrowing perspective, I think the risks are within the South African context are high. Government hasn't covered itself in glory with all the corruption around the PPE and the COVID spending. So there's some question about whether additional money, even borrowed, is going to go down a black hole, or whether it's actually going to be used to drive the economy.
Can the government really afford to borrow a little bit further for its quest to ensure that the livelihoods of South Africans are maintained? I mean, most South Africans have lost their jobs. Most South Africans have had to take huge pay cuts, and they need some sort of financial relief.
Yeah, so typically government would provide would become a catalyst to drive economic demand and get it going again. So I think we will see some boost coming from just reopening the hospitality industry under improved protocols to protect people from COVID, which people are now understand a lot better than they did in March. That will help, just naturally that will help. But I think that it's going to be difficult to raise a lot of additional funds for government. It will probably have to reorganize some of its own spending in order to be able to boost those areas of the economy where we can get most leverage. We really do need to look at that. But the problem with government at the moment is it's very slow to restructure its own activities. It's very quick to devastate the private sector, but it is very slow to drive any change, any structural change within its own area of domain.
And these negative economic shocks are so large, are so sufficiently large to push many households into positions of food insecurity. And this reduced capability to buy food has been brought about by the severe shock to household income rather than a shock to food availability, such as in a drought. So many South Africans are now on the brink of hunger as a result of the lack of means to provide food for their families. Am I not? Yeah, am I correct?
Yes, I think we're in a very difficult position, and that government in itself not only has had a poor response from to supporting households, in other words, being able to identify them and support them because of the machinery of our social security system is so weak that it can't really identify people in need very well and efficiently. There's also been corruption in the distribution of, for instance, food parcels and those kinds of support measures. And then we've had very, very slow-moving efforts from the Unemployment Insurance Fund and the as well as moving some of the additional loan funds that government has created in order to support business that have just not, they're just too slow to move. And that's to a large extent because we lack the systems in place to actually very efficiently support much of any part of our economy that is suddenly in need. But I think that we are going to have to deepen our support to people in desperate need. We have to do that, but we're going to have to do that by also restructuring what we do in government, because we can't just carry on the way we're doing and then try and sort of redistribute. We've actually run out of a lot of runway at the moment because of the shutting down the supply and demand side of the economy simultaneously. It is so damaging, and we're going to have to be incredibly careful as to how we move out. But we've got to support people and we've got to get businesses going.
And as the pandemic recedes, South Africa should definitely look to rebuild more fiscal resources so that it can respond to a future crisis. Which ones are these? I mean, with so much talk with regards, or rather criticism leveled towards the South African government about the issue of corruption and depleted resources, what are the sources of, for more new fiscal resources that the country should look into building?
So a large amount of money is tied up in very inefficient spending within government. Now, restructuring that in a very short period of time is quite difficult, but it does need to become a priority. But there is no sense that government actually understands how to do this at the moment. So this is a concern. But it's one thing that has to happen. We have very bloated administrations of people who are very inefficient, who don't do a great deal. We've got very poor systems in place, and we've seen how in many cases, the health systems in many provinces have just failed to respond effectively during this period because they've got a history now of internalized and endemic corruption that has basically destroyed the integrity of their performance. So on the one hand, we've got the wrong people employed within the system. We've got the wrong organizational structures. We've got too many people earning too much, doing too little within government. And that needs to be, and that is effectively where some of the money is tied up. On the other hand, we have many health services and public services that are very labor intensive, and rightfully so. And they and you can't just cut those services, but we would have to reorganize a lot of the administrations and the areas where money is just being wastefully spent. But we basically do have to find money within government to redirect those resources. I think that government will try very hard to find additional capital to borrow to support and inject energy back into the economy. It has to do that, and it has to become fairly creative about doing that, given that we've been downgraded so drastically in South Africa. But we have to lower the cost of borrowing, and we also have to be able to access borrowing. Those are the two constraints that we will have to overcome in the next 3 years. But I expect it's going to be a slow walk out. And a lot of what happens in South Africa is going to depend on the extent to which a lot of the other and larger economies in the world stimulate their way out of the COVID crisis. Because I don't think that South Africa is going to do too well on its own. It's going to depend very much on the rest of the world also driving economic growth.
What are your thoughts of the efficacy and the effectiveness of the lockdown? I mean, so much criticism has been leveled against the government with regards to some of the rules which are quite unnatural and which have solicited business and the trade union movement to come together and calling for a more liberal interpretation of some of the rules. So what are your thoughts on the lockdown?
I think that the lockdown was very, very poorly thought through. You always required a balance of risk approach in responding to the epidemic. South Africa is not the United Kingdom or the United States or New York. It's not a country that can luxuriously enter into lockdowns without consideration of the long-term and even medium-term consequences. It's got to basically take the economic aspects into account. We have seen a huge surge in excess deaths in South Africa. Now, some people might regard those excess deaths as being unrecorded COVID deaths. That's certainly not my interpretation. And there would still have to be a lot of analysis of this. I estimate only an undercount on COVID-related specific deaths of around about 3,000 to 4,000. That's an undercount. This would leave about 29,000 excess deaths that could be regarded as collateral deaths. In other words, those are deaths caused indirectly by the epidemic and potentially by the lockdown itself. So the lockdown itself is incredibly damaging socially and economically. And we are going to be having to carefully count the cost of what this lockdown has actually done to this sort of viability of many societies and communities in South Africa. I think that it's had even a more severe effect than we fully understand at this point. And those deaths, potential collateral deaths, and the scale of them are one of the first proxy indicators of the damage. And I think that what we should have really considered early on was getting the health protocols in place for our economy to reopen safely. Mm-hmm. And that type of those initiatives should have been in place by the end of April and the early part of May, but they weren't. Our testing and tracing strategy was not in place. We were meant to have a tracing app in place by the end of April. No tracing, and now the president's only just announced a tracing app to be in place, well after we've experienced major surges in the epidemic. So those non-pharmaceutical interventions, critical to suppressing the epidemic while keeping the economy open, had to be our core strategy in the South African context. That's not going to be the core strategy in the United Kingdom or in France, but it has to be the one in South Africa, and we didn't do it. So we're now suffering huge consequences that potentially we could have avoided.
All right, Alex van der Heever, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your thoughts.